morning. I've entitled it AWOL. I try not to be always subject specific. I usually try and teach you something that I've been personally engaged in with study. I don't usually try and tie my messages into current events. Occasionally I've done that, but not very often. But because today was Father's Day, and because I'm a dad, I thought I would write something that I need to listen to for myself, and hopefully it's a blessing to you. Because I'm really struck by the fact that in our society today, a lot of dads are missing in action, MIA, or AWOL, absent without leave. And so I thought I would write this lesson to encourage me, and hopefully the dads who are here, to do what they need to do to be engaged with their family, using David as an example. So the text of the lesson is taken from 2 Samuel, an Old Testament book, chapter 15, verse 30. It's just one verse. But I want to build on this verse as it relates to being AWOL. David went on up the Mount of Olives crying. He was barefoot and had his head covered as a sign of grief. All who followed him covered their heads and cried also. And to give you an idea, David at this point in his life looks a lot older than his 60 years would lead one to believe. His shoulders are slumped. His head is hanging. He's shuffling like an old man. He struggles to place even one foot in front of the other. He pauses often, partly because the hill is steep, but also partly because he needs to pause so that he can cry. This is the longest path I think that David has ever walked. It's certainly much longer than the one from the creek side to slay Goliath. It's certainly longer than the winding road that he took from being a fugitive, chased by Saul, to then eventually being the king of Israel. Or even maybe that guilty road from being convicted of his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba to his eventual confession almost 1 year later as a result of the prompting of the prophet Nathan. Because all those trails, without a doubt, were steep. I mean, they had some twists and turns to them, to be sure, but none of them, I don't think, compared to his ascent up the Mount of Olives. Because at this point in time in life, he's not wearing a crown. His son, Absalom, has taken it by force. He doesn't have a home because the walls that are to his back as he's going up Mount Olives is the city of Jerusalem, the city that he had established, the capital city of Israel. And he's leaving that city. He's departing that city. He's fled the capital that he had been singularly responsible for establishing. He wouldn't cry, but now he can and does, because who wouldn't cry? I mean, why wouldn't you be weeping? You have no throne, you have no home, and Jerusalem is behind him, and the wilderness and uncertain future are ahead of him. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, well, what happened? I mean, did Jerusalem get sacked in some sort of a war, or was it ravaged by some disease like Ebola? I mean, did famine starve his loved ones and drain his strength? I mean, how does a king end up old and lonely and walking on this very difficult uphill path? Well, the answer is all you need to do is ask his wives and his kids. If you were to ask David about his kids, he'd probably wince just a little bit. You see, 14 years by this time have passed since David had seduced Bathsheba, and 13 years since Nathan had told David in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 10, "The sword will never depart from your house." And Nathan's prophecy has proven to be very painfully true in David's life. Because one of David's sons, Amnon, fell in lust with his half-sister Tamar, one of David's daughters from another marriage. And Amnon craved her. Amnon connived her. And then Amnon raped her. And then, after the rape, just kicked her to the curb like yesterday's garbage. Tamar, understandably, fell apart emotionally and physically. She threw ashes on her head. She tore this robe of many colors that these daughters of the king who were virgins would wear proudly, celebrating their femininity, celebrating their life as a child of the king. And she tears that robe of many colors, and she remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. We know that from 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 20. So Tamar gets raped by Amnon, her half-brother, and Tamar then finds solace in her brother Absalom's house. And the next verse tells us David's response now to Amnon's brutality. Here's what it says. When King David heard all of these things, he was very angry. And you read that and you think, that's it? That's all? I mean, don't we want a slightly longer verse there? Don't we want a verb there that says, like, confronted him, maybe punished him, maybe banished him? I mean, we want that verse to say, David was very angry and confronted Amnon, or David was very angry and punished Amnon, or David was really upset and banished Amnon. But what did David do? Nothing. No lecture, no penalty, no imprisonment, no even dressing down his son. No chewing out, no nothing. And even worse, he did nothing for his daughter, Tamar. She needed his protection, especially now. As vulnerable as she has been made to feel, she needs her dad's protection. She needs her dad's affirmation. She needs her dad's validation. She needed a dad. But what she got was silence. So, Absalom, her brother, filled the void that had been created by David's passivity. He sheltered his sister and plotted against his brother Amnon. And then one night, Absalom got Amnon drunk and had him murdered. So in just one family now, just one family, we have incest, we have deceit, we have one daughter raped, we have another son dead, and another son with blood on his hands. David's is a palace in absolute turmoil. And again, it was time for David, the dad, to step up. Display some courage here. Be like he was when he slayed Goliath, or be like he was when he pardoned Saul, or be the leader like he was when he had this campaign at Brook Besor. We've talked about that, David. That's what David needed to be at this point in time in his life. But they saw none of it. He didn't intervene. David didn't even respond. He wept instead, in complete isolation. Now, Absalom interpreted David's silence and inaction as anger and fled to Jerusalem to hide in his grandfather's house. And David made absolutely no attempt whatsoever to see his son. Not at all. For 3 years, he and Absalom lived in 2 separate cities. Absalom eventually even returned back to Jerusalem, but David continued to refuse to see his son. Absalom even married and had 4 kids. We know in 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 28, it says, Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, but did not see the king's face. And church, I'm just telling you, that kind of shunning had to have been purposeful. I mean, you had to be rather clever to not run into your own son. I mean, Jerusalem is the capital, yes, but it's not some huge city like L.A. I mean, David would have had to have plotted and planned and connived and scheduled his activities to make sure that he did not see his son. Avoiding Absalom likely demanded daily planning and spying. But David succeeded. He succeeded in neglecting his son. More accurately, he neglected all of his kids. A passage from later in his life reveals David's parenting philosophy. One of his sons, Adonijah, had staged a coup, and he assembled chariots and horsemen and personal bodyguards to take the throne. This is his own son now, going to have an insurrection against his dad and his leadership. And did David object? Are you kidding me? It says in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 6, David never crossed him any time by asking, "Why have you done so?" Turn to the next slide, Ray. That's David, the Homer Simpson of biblical dads. He is the picture of passivity. So when we ask him about his kids, he winces, he even groans. But when we ask him about his wives, his face would probably go a chalky white. Because we began to suspect a little trouble in David's family way back in 2 Samuel chapter 3. And what initially just appears as this rather dull genealogy, it's actually a parade of red flags. Let me read it to you. Sons were born to David at Hebron. The first was Amnon, whose mother was whose mother was Ahinoam from Jezreel. The second son was Kileab, whose mother was Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel. The third son was Absalom, whose mother was Maacah, daughter of Talmi, the king of Geshur. The fourth son was Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith. The fifth son was Shephatiah, whose mother was Abital. The sixth son was Ithream, whose mother was Eglah, David's wife. These sons were born to David at Hebron. So church, count them. 6 wives. You add to this list Michal, who was David's first wife, given to him by Saul, if you recall, and Bathsheba, his most famous wife, and David had 8 spouses. He had more spouses than he could share with one day a week. And the situation worsens as we uncover a passage that's buried real deep in David's family Bible. After listing the names of his sons, the genealogist then adds this at 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 9. These were all of the sons of David besides the sons of the concubines. The concubines? Yeah, the sons of the mistresses. David fathered other sons through other mothers, and we don't even know how many. And what about the girls? I mean, we know about Tamar, right? And surely he probably had other daughters as well. The cynical side of us wonders if David even knew how many kids he actually had. David, did so much, so well. I've preached a series of lessons on David. He is a fascinating character in the Bible. He is the only person that God would say was a man after his own heart. There's something so engaging about David. He unified 12 tribes into one nation. He masterminded military conquests. He founded the capital city and elevated God as the Lord of the people of Israel, bringing the Ark of the Covenant back into Jerusalem and paving the way for the temple. He wrote poetry that we still read. He wrote psalms that we still sing. But when it came to his family, David was MIA. Going AWOL on his family was David's greatest failure. Oh, seducing Bathsheba was an inexcusable, but at least explicable moment of passion. Or murdering Uriah, her husband, was a ruthless act, yet predictable because it came from a desperate heart. But passive parenting and widespread philandering, these weren't sins of a lazy afternoon or the deranged reactions of someone in self-defense mode. David's family foul-up was a lifelong stupor that cost him dearly. Because do you remember Absalom? David finally reunited with him. Remember, he fled because he thought David was angry, lived a few years with his grandfather, and then Absalom came back to Jerusalem, had kids, wanted to see David. Eventually, he does come back to Jerusalem, and David reunites with him. But by then, church, it was too late. The seeds of bitterness had grown very deep roots in Absalom's life, and Absalom decided to overthrow his dad. He recruited from David's own army and staged essentially a coup d'etat. And his takeover set the stage for the sad walk of David out of Jerusalem with which we started this message. Up the Mount of Olives and out into the wilderness. No crown, no city, just a heavy-hearted, lonely, old man. Loyalists eventually chased Absalom down, and when he tried to escape on horseback, as we know from what the Bible said, his long hair gets tangled in a tree, and soldiers then spear him to death. When David hears the news of his son's death, he falls literally to pieces. He says in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 33, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, if only I had died in your place. My son Absalom, my son." A little late for that, don't you think? David succeeded everywhere except at home. And if you don't succeed at home, my question of you and me is, do you succeed at all? How do you explain David's disastrous household? How do we explain David's silence when it comes to his family? I mean, no psalms were ever written about his kids. And surely out of all of his wives, we know of 8 of them, plus the mistresses, you'd think maybe he could have written a sonnet or two about at least one of them. But he never talked about them. Aside from the prayer that he offered that Bathsheba and his baby would survive, which it did not, Scripture gives us absolutely no indication whatsoever that he ever prayed for his family. He prayed about the Philistines. Those were his enemies. He prayed and interceded for his soldiers. Those were his employees. He offered prayers for Jonathan. That was his friend. He even offered a prayer for Saul, who was his archenemy. But as far as his family was concerned, it's as if they never existed. I mean, was David just too busy to notice them? I happen to be an Eagles fan. In a more recent Eagles album, it's a really kind of a cool song because it says a lot. And it talks about a relationship between a man and a woman that is falling apart because she is too busy being fabulous. So was David too busy? Was he too busy to notice his family? Well, maybe. I mean, he had a city to settle, right? And a kingdom to build. Was David too important to care for them? I mean, maybe he's rationalizing, let the wives raise the kids. I'll run the nation. He had plenty of them to do it, right? Was he too guilty, maybe, to shepherd his own family? I mean, after all, how could David, who seduced Bathsheba and then intoxicated and murdered her husband, Uriah, how could he correct his own sons when they raped and murdered themselves? Too busy, too important, too guilty, and now too late. A dozen exits too late. But men, and I'm speaking to you, it's not too late for you. It's not too late for me. Your home is your giant-sized privilege, your towering priority. Don't make David's tragic mistake. He collected wives like he collected trophies. He saw spouses as a means to his pleasure, not a part of God's plan. So church, and men in particular, don't make David's mistake. Be fiercely loyal to your spouse. You've made a promise, so keep it. And as you do, nourish the children that God may have given you. You know, there are quiet heroes that dot the landscape of our society and our lives. They don't wear ribbons, and they don't kiss trophies. They wear spit up, and they kiss owies. They don't make the headlines, but they do check the outlines, and they stand on the sidelines. You won't find their names on a Nobel Peace Prize shortlist, but you'll find their names on the homeroom list or the carpool list. News programs don't call them, but that's okay because their kids do. They call her mom, and they call him dad. Be numbered among those heroes. That's the group you want to identify with, because your children are not your hobby. They are your calling. And your spouse is not your trophy. She or he is your treasure. Don't pay the price that David paid. Because if you flip ahead just a few chapters to David's final hours, you will see the ultimate cost that David paid for neglecting his family. David is now just hours from passing away. And a chill has set in his body that blankets, just can't warm up. So his servants decide that he needs a person to snuggle with, someone to hold him tight as David starts the process of drawing in his last breaths. But do they turn to one of his wives? No. Okay, well, do they turn to one of the kids? Hardly. 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 3 and 4 tells us the following. They looked in every corner of Israel until they found Abishag from Shunem. They brought her to the king. She was very beautiful, and she cared for the king and served him, but the king didn't have sex with her. Oh, that's nice. So they gave him a heatilator. His conquered crowns for the tender arms of a wife. But it was too late. Now it's hundreds of exits too late. David died in the care of a complete stranger because he had made complete strangers out of his family. But the good news, church, is it's not too late for you. It's not too late for you. Make your wife your highest devotion. Make your husband the recipient of your deepest passion. Love the one who wears your ring. And cherish the children who share your name. on Father's Day, I want you and me to succeed at home first. Because as Jesus said in Luke chapter 12, verse 34, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. This isn't one of those happy, cheery, happy-go-lucky, skipping out of the building kind of lessons today, I know. But unfortunately, as a society, I don't think that there is enough discussion about dads taking responsibility for themselves and for their family. The Bible talks about it, and I'm going to share that with you. And remember, I'm just a messenger here. I'm not the preacher. I study this stuff because I need the instruction. I need the help. I need to be reminded that my highest priority, other than being a child of God, is to succeed at home. My kids are not going to care if I'm a billionaire. My kids are not going to care if I have a $5 million mansion. My kids are not going to care if I make the headlines in the newspapers. My kids are not going to care if I can give them $1 million inheritance, but my kids will care that I can pick up the phone and call them. I can be with them. I can engage with them because they're my kids. They share my name. And I have a responsibility as a father to be present in their life. I don't want to be like a David. He succeeded wildly beyond anybody's imagination. And where did it get him with his family? Sleeping with a stranger. Is that where you want to be? I don't think so. So dads, engage with your kids. It's not too late. And if you don't have children, share the message with a dad who could use it. Because far too many dads these days are AWOL. They're absent without leave. Their wives didn't give them permission to check out of their family, but they did for whatever reason. And if dads would be more connected and involved with their families, I think our society would be substantially improved with dads being involved with their family. But it starts first with you, Dad. It starts first with your heart. And it starts with your priorities, knowing that success occurs first at home. So I've selected a song for us to sing now at the close of the message, "Oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer." He is our Father. We want to be like him. I'm challenging you dads that if you be more like him, you'll be more the dad that you need to be. You know, Steve shared some thoughts about his growing up and about his involvement with his dad. My dad was more on the business success side than more on the engaged side. Later along in life, we began to kind of restore that relationship. It became much closer. Although my dad and I had a relationship like we called each other every 6 months, whether we needed to or not. Now, sometimes we called each other more often than that, and certainly later on in his life we did. And then my dad passed away 3 years ago. So I don't have that opportunity to talk with him, but I do have an opportunity to be me, and that's a dad. Unfortunately, I have the privilege that you've offered me and given to me to share with you, especially the dads, to be engaged with your family. Succeed at home first, because otherwise everything else is emptiness. So let's stand and let's sing this song, please.